The water was too still for a place so forbidden. That was the first thing I noticed, the absolute silence of it, the way the lake held the moonlight like a secret it refused to share with anyone. No wind touched its surface. No frog called from the reeds along its edge. It was as though the water itself understood that it belonged to someone powerful, and in that understanding, it had learned to hold its breath. I should have turned back. I knew it the moment my worn leather boots sank into the soft mud at the lake's edge. Cold earth swallowing my feet up to the ankle as if the ground itself was trying to warn me. The tall pines that circled the water like cathedral pillars cast long shadows across the moonlit grass, and somewhere behind me, 3 miles of dark forest separated this place from the servants' quarter of Ironvale Castle, where I was supposed to be sleeping, where every other Omega in the kingdom would have been sleeping, sensibly, quietly, without ever dreaming of something as reckless as this. But I had not been able to breathe inside those walls for 6 days. 6 days since I had arrived at Ironvale as part of the seasonal tribute. Not a gift of gold or grain, but of labor. 12 Omegas selected from the outer villages to serve the castle for 1 full turn of the moon. Cooking, mending, scrubbing the great stone floors until our knees ached. It was not cruel, not exactly. The head housekeeper, a stout beta woman named Marta, was efficient rather than unkind. The food was adequate. The sleeping pallets were thin, but dry. But the walls. The walls of Ironvale were made of black stone quarried from the northern mountains, and they seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. I had grown up in the village of Ashfan, where our cottage had a low ceiling and 3 walls that never quite kept the wind out, but the windows faced east, and every morning the sunrise came through them like a living thing, warm and insistent, and full of promise. In Ironvale, the servants' quarter had no windows, only a single iron grate near the ceiling that let in cold air and the distant sound of guards changing watch. By the 3rd night, I had stopped sleeping properly. By the 6th, I had stopped pretending to try. So I had wrapped my gray woolen cloak around my shoulders, tucked my long blonde braid inside the hood, and slipped out through the side gate that the older kitchen servant, a wiry old beta named Corvin, always left unlatched after his evening rounds. I did not know where I was going. I only knew I needed sky above me and open air around me. Needed it the way a person needs water after 3 days without. The forest had not frightened me. I was from Ashfan. I had grown up navigating dark woods and mossy paths, and the kind of silence that has texture to it. Weight. What surprised me was what waited at the forest's end. This lake, hidden behind a ring of ancient pines, its water the color of hammered pewter under the half-moon, its surface so perfectly undisturbed that it looked like a mirror left lying in the grass. I had stood at its edge for a long time. There had been no sign posted, no carved warning driven into the earth. But I had heard the whispers in the castle kitchens, the way the other servants spoke about the northern grounds in hushed, careful voices. The King's Lake, the private grounds. No one goes north of the old oak trail. No one. And yet here I was. I told myself I would only sit, only breathe, only look at the water and feel the sky above me, and let my lungs remember what open space felt like. I sat down on a flat stone at the lake's edge and pulled my cloak tight and stared at the reflection of the stars, and for a little while, it was enough. Then the water shifted. Not from wind. The air was perfectly still. It was something below the surface, some slow current or underground spring, and it sent a single ripple outward from the center of the lake, a perfect ring expanding toward me until it lapped softly against the stone at my feet. The cold touch of it against my skin sent something through me that I had not expected. Not fear, but longing. A pull I could not entirely explain. Before I fully understood what I was doing, I had removed my boots. Then my cloak, folded carefully on the flat stone. Then I had waded in. The cold hit me like a held breath finally released. It rushed up my legs, my waist, gripped my chest in a way that forced every shallow, anxious thought out of my mind in an instant. There was only the water. Only the cold, clean, absolute present moment. I let it take me deeper, pushed off from the silted bottom, and floated on my back with my arms outstretched and the whole dark sky above me. And for the first time in 6 days, I felt like myself. I did not hear him approach. I did not hear anything. Not footsteps. Not the shift of armored leather. Not the snap of a twig under a heavy boot. The first indication I had that I was not alone was a shadow falling across the water. A large, still shadow that had not been there a moment before. I found my footing fast, standing chest-deep in the lake, water streaming from my hair as I turned toward the bank. He stood at the edge of the flat stone where I had left my cloak and boots. Still. Completely, unnervingly still. He was tall enough that even at this distance, even in the dimness of half-moonlight, he seemed to rearrange the space around him. Black hair pulled back in long braided cords that fell past his shoulders. A leather breastplate, crossed with thick brown straps. A cloak of dark fur over one shoulder. And even from the water, even with the moonlight at his back casting his face half in shadow, I could see his eyes. Blue, sharp and cold and entirely focused on me. I knew who he was. Every Omega in Ironvale knew Sebastian's face. His portrait hung in the great hall. His name was spoken by servants in the same tone used for weather. Inevitable, impersonal, beyond negotiation. The Alpha King of Ironvale. The man who had united 3 fractured territories through a combination of battlefield dominance and political ruthlessness. The man whose council feared him, whose enemies did not tend to remain enemies for long. The man whose private lake I was currently standing in, dripping in my underdress, with absolutely no explanation that would save me. He did not speak immediately. He looked at me the way a man looks at something that does not fit the landscape. Not with anger, not yet, but with a kind of slow, careful attention that was somehow worse than shouting would have been. His gaze moved from my face to the folded cloak on the stone, to my boots beside it, and then back to my face. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, unhurried, carrying across the still water without effort, the way a stone drops to the bottom of a well. "This lake," he said, "is not open to the castle servants." I opened my mouth, closed it. My heart was doing something violent and unhelpful in my chest, and the cold water that had felt so freeing 30 seconds ago now felt like a trap closing around me. "I know," I said. The honesty surprised even me. I had expected to find an excuse, an apology wrapped in something plausible. Instead, those 2 words came out flat and simple and entirely true. Something shifted in his expression. Not softening exactly, more like a slight adjustment, the way a hawk tilts its head when it spots movement it did not anticipate. "You know," he repeated. "Yes, my lord." The silence stretched. A night bird called once from deep in the pines and fell quiet. The water around me barely moved. "Then why are you in it?" I looked at him across the dark water. This man who could have me sent from the castle before sunrise, could have me punished in ways I did not want to imagine. And I thought about lying. Thought about a dozen reasonable-sounding explanations. And then I thought about the windowless room, and the 6 sleepless nights, and the way the castle walls seemed to press inward when no one was watching. "Because I needed to breathe," I said quietly. "My lord." He said nothing for a long moment. The moonlight caught the scar along his jaw, a thin, pale line I had not noticed in the portrait, and he held my gaze with an expression I could not name. Then, very slowly, he sat down on the flat stone beside my folded cloak. Not to leave. not to summon the guards. He simply sat down, forearms resting on his knees, and looked out at the water, as though he intended to wait. I did not know what to do with a king who simply sat down and waited. Every instinct I had, every lesson Ashfin had ever pressed into me about rank and deference and the vast distance between an Omega servant and the man who ruled the territory she lived in, told me to wade out of the water immediately, collect my cloak, drop into the lowest bow I could manage, and apologize until he grew tired of hearing it. That was the expected shape of this moment. That was the script every person of my station would have followed without hesitation. But he had sat down, not stood with crossed arms and a cold expression waiting for my groveling, not called for the night guard. He had simply lowered himself onto the flat stone beside my folded cloak and turned his gaze toward the lake. And his posture, those broad shoulders dropped just slightly from their full height, forearms loose on his knees, held something I was not prepared for. He looked tired. Not the ordinary tiredness of a man who had worked a long day. Something older than that. Something that lived behind his eyes and had nothing to do with the hour. I stayed where I was, chest deep in the cold water, because I did not know what moving would mean. The situation had stopped following any pattern I understood, and so I held still the way a deer holds still in open ground, not from bravery, but from the particular paralysis of having no good options in any direction. After a stretch of silence long enough that the night bird in the pines called again and fell quiet a second time, he spoke. "How long have you been at Ironvale?" His voice was the same as before, low, unhurried, with no particular inflection to suggest whether the question was casual or an interrogation wearing casual clothing. 6 days, my lord. And in 6 days you have already found the one place in the entire castle grounds that is marked off limits. It wasn't quite a question. There was something in it that might, in a different man, in different circumstances, have been dry humor. I couldn't be certain. There was no marking, I said carefully. No post. No carved sign. "There doesn't need to be a sign," he said. "Everyone knows." "I heard the other servants speak of it," I admitted. I knew. He turned his head then and looked at me directly, and I felt the full weight of those blue eyes in a way that was different from being watched by ordinary people. Alpha gaze had always carried a particular quality, a kind of pressure, a density of attention that you felt physically, in the back of your neck and along your arms. Sebastian's was more than that. His was the gaze of a man who had spent years making decisions that other people had to live with, and it had given his attention a gravity that seemed to bend the air around it. "You knew," he said, "and you came anyway." Yes. Why? I had already told him why. Because I needed to breathe. But the way he asked the question suggested he had not forgotten my answer and was not asking for a different one. He was asking me to go deeper into it, to explain something he had heard, but not yet understood. I thought about the windowless room, about the way 6 nights of compressed, lightless sleep had made me feel like something pressed too long between heavy stones, about the particular loneliness of being among 11 other women who shared the same circumstances and still managed to feel entirely foreign to me, not unkind, not cruel, simply oriented toward a different internal world than the one I had always lived inside. "The servants' quarter has no windows," I said at last, "and I grew up with sky." Something moved across his face. Too fast to name. There and gone the way a cloud shadow moves across a field. "Ashfin," I added, because I did not know why I was still talking. But the silence between his question and my answer had felt like something that needed filling. "It is a small village, eastern edge of the Greywood. Our cottage was near an open meadow." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I know where Ashfin is." Of course he did. He knew where everything in his territory was. That was the nature of being what he was. "You may come out of the water," he said then, and turned his gaze back toward the lake's center. "You will freeze." The permission, if that was what it was, landed strangely. Not a dismissal, not an order to leave the grounds immediately. Simply a practical observation delivered without particular feeling. I waded toward the bank slowly, acutely aware of every sound I made. The soft drag of water against my underdress, the quiet pull of the mud under my feet, the small splash as I stepped up onto the grass. I reached for my cloak and drew it around my shoulders, and the wool was damp from the night air, but still warmer than the lake, and I stood on the flat stone, 2 feet from the AlphaKing of Iron Vale, with water dripping from my braid onto the hem of my cloak, and absolutely no idea what was supposed to happen next. He did not look at me. He was watching the lake, and there was something in the quality of his stillness that suggested he was not merely being polite by looking away. He was somewhere else, partially. Some interior country that the lake's surface apparently helped him reach. I sat down. Not beside him. I chose the far edge of the flat stone, leaving a careful distance between us, and I drew my knees up under my cloak and looked out at the water as he did, and I thought, this is the strangest night of my life, and possibly the last one I spend as a free person, and somehow I am sitting beside the king watching his private lake, as though I belong here. "You said it changed everything," he said quietly. "When you heard the other servants speak of this place." I frowned, not following him. "What they said about it," he continued. "What made you come, despite knowing?" I considered it honestly, the way the night somehow made honesty easier, the darkness softening the edges of consequence, the late hour stripping away the usual careful management of what a person in my position said to a person in his. "They said no one ever came here," I told him, "that it was always empty, that you had not been seen near it in over a year." I paused. It sounded like a place that was lonely. Silence. A long one this time. Long enough that the half-moon moved a fraction in the sky above us, and the pines shifted with the first faint stir of a night breeze that had not been there before. "And you thought a lonely place needed company," he said finally. "I thought I needed a place that understood what I felt," I said quietly. "That is perhaps the same thing." I heard him exhale. It was the smallest sound, barely more than a controlled breath, the kind a man makes when something has reached him that he was not braced for. When I glanced sidelong at him, his jaw was set, and his gaze was still fixed on the water. But there was a line between his brows that had not been there before. He was not angry. I did not know what he was exactly, but it was not anger. "What is your name?" he asked. "Penny, my lord." He repeated it once, under his breath, as though setting it in place somewhere. Penny. Then he was quiet again, and we sat in that improbable silence together. The AlphaKing with his fur cloak and his tired blue eyes, and the Omega servant from Ashfen with her wet braid and her borrowed boldness, while the lake held its breath around us, and the stars slowly turned overhead. I should have been terrified. Part of me was, in the background, a low hum of awareness that this was dangerous territory in every sense. But sitting there, in the open air, with the sky above me and the smell of cold pine and dark water filling my lungs, I felt something I had not felt since leaving Ashfen. Present. Entirely. Simply present. It was he who finally broke the silence in a way that changed its texture entirely. "You will be assigned to the castle library beginning tomorrow," he said. It came out measured, deliberate, like a decision that had already been made somewhere internal before it reached his voice. "The head librarian, Brother Aldrich, needs an assistant. The work is quieter than the kitchens. The room has windows." I turned to look at him fully, certain I had misheard. He stood, adjusting the clasp of his fur cloak with one hand, and looked down at me with that same unreadable blue gaze. "The lake," he said, "is still off limits." And then he walked back into the dark tree line and was gone, as quietly as he had come, leaving me sitting on the flat stone with my wet cloak and my stunned silence and the absolutely impossible feeling that something had just begun that I did not have a name for yet. Brother Aldrich was a small man with ink-stained fingers and the particular energy of someone who had spent so many decades among books that he had begun to resemble one. Compact, dense with information, slightly dusty at the edges, and deeply suspicious of anyone who did not handle his shelves with appropriate reverence. He looked at me the morning I arrived at the library door with an expression that suggested Marta had not entirely prepared him for my presence. "You are the new assistant," he said. It was not a question. It was the tone of a man confirming an unfortunate weather forecast. "Yes, Brother Aldrich." He studied me for a moment, the worn hem of my dress, the practical braid, the hands that were more accustomed to scrubbing than to careful cataloging, and then he stepped aside and let me in. The library of Ironvale Castle occupied the entirety of the East Tower's second and third floors, connected by a narrow stone staircase worn smooth by generations of scholars' boots. The shelves were floor to ceiling, dark oak aged to near black, packed with manuscripts and bound volumes and rolled scrolls tucked into wooden cubbies along the lower walls. The smell hit me first. Old parchment, candle wax, the faint mineral ghost of dried ink. And beneath it something warmer, something that reminded me unexpectedly of the interior of an old chapel, as though long years of concentrated thought had given the air itself a kind of gravity. And the windows, 3 of them on the east wall, tall and narrow, their leaded panes letting in the pale morning light in long, clean rectangles that fell across the floor like gifts. I stood in the middle of that light and breathed. "The cataloging system," Brother Aldrich said behind me, already moving toward the shelves with the brisk authority of a man reclaiming his domain, "is my own design and has been in use for 40 years. You will learn it exactly as it is. You will not improve it, reorganize it, or suggest alternatives." "Of course," I said. "You will dust the upper shelves on Tuesdays and Fridays. You will never use a damp cloth on any manuscript regardless of what is on it. You will replace every candle in the reading alcoves before the evening bell, not after." "Understood." He paused and looked at me over his shoulder with mild suspicion, as though my compliance was itself somewhat questionable. "Can you read?" he asked. "Yes." Another pause. "How well?" "Well enough to follow your cataloging system, Brother Aldrich." Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, exactly, but the slight recalibration of a man who has braced for less and received more. He turned back to the shelves. "We will see," he said. The other servants noticed the change in my assignment by midday. I became aware of it at the noon meal in the great kitchen. The slight shift in conversation as I entered. The way Marta's sharp eyes moved from her ledger to my face and back again, with an expression that contained more questions than she allowed herself to ask. The other Omegas who had arrived with me from the outer villages. A quiet girl named Bess from the western fen country, and a sharp-tongued, warm-hearted woman named Cora, who was 26 and had more confidence in her small finger than I had in my entire body, exchanged a glance across the table that I felt rather than saw. "Library," Cora said, not looking at me, tearing her bread into precise pieces. "Since when does Marta assign Omegas to the library?" "She didn't," Bess said softly, also not looking at me, her eyes on her bowl. The silence that followed was the conversational equivalent of a raised eyebrow. I said nothing and ate my soup and studied the grain of the wooden table, and the subject moved on to other things, and I told myself that the warmth rising in my face was simply the heat from the kitchen fire. It wasn't, entirely. The days settled into a pattern that I would not have predicted and could not have invented. The library was its own world, quieter than the rest of the castle, in a way that felt deliberate rather than empty, as though the silence there had been curated over centuries and was now maintained by a kind of institutional understanding that noise was a form of disrespect toward the accumulated thought on the shelves. Brother Aldrich was exacting and occasionally brusque and had very strong opinions about the correct angle at which scrolls should be re-rolled, but he was not unkind, and after the first 3 days, he began leaving me to work independently for stretches of an hour or more, which I took as the highest form of approval he was likely to offer. I learned his cataloging system. It was, I had to admit, elegant, organized not by subject alone, but by a layered cross-reference of origin, date of acquisition, and the name of the scholar who had last consulted the volume, so that the shelves told a kind of story about the intellectual life of the castle over the past 4 decades. I found it genuinely interesting, and the finding of it interesting surprised me, because no one had ever suggested that I might find such a thing interesting, least of all myself. On the 5th morning in the library, I was working my way through a section of older manuscripts on the 3rd floor, cataloging discrepancies between Aldrich's records and what was actually on the shelves, when I heard the door below open and close. Not Aldrich's step. His had a particular rhythm, the slight drag of his left foot from an old injury. This was heavier, more even, with the particular quality of someone accustomed to moving quietly, despite their size, and not entirely succeeding in a stone-floored room. I kept my eyes on the manuscript in front of me and did not move. The footsteps came up the narrow stair. They paused at the top. I heard him before I saw him. Or rather, I felt the shift in the room's atmosphere. That same gravitational change I had felt at the lake's edge, as though the air redistributed itself around the presence of him. "Brother Aldrich says you reorganized the Eastern manuscript alcove," Sebastian said. I turned carefully. He was standing at the top of the stair with his arms loose at his sides, and his blue eyes moving across the shelves in a way that was not quite casual, taking inventory, assessing, the habit of a man who processed rooms as strategic spaces, even when strategy was not the point. "I catalogued the discrepancies," I said. "There were 14 manuscripts listed in the record that were shelved in the wrong section. I moved them to where the catalog said they should be." "Aldrich says that is not the same as where he had put them." "It isn't," I agreed. "But the catalog was correct, and the shelving was not." I followed the catalog. A pause. "He also says you read faster than any assistant he has had in 20 years. I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing. Sebastian moved to the nearest shelf and ran one finger along the spines of a row of bound volumes with the particular attention of a man who had been in this room before, many times, and knew it differently than I did. There was something in the gesture, unhurried, almost private, that made me feel I was witnessing something not intended for an audience. "You read the manuscripts," he said. It was not quite an accusation. "I catalogued them," I said carefully. "You read them while you catalogued them." I hesitated. "Some of them. Yes." He pulled one volume from the shelf and looked at the cover, then at me. And the 3rd century account of the Greywood border disputes is considerably less accurate than the castle seems to believe, I said before I could stop myself. The author was writing with a political purpose. Half of what is recorded as territorial agreement was actually contested land held by informal arrangement. The maps in the Eastern Corridor repeat the same errors. The silence that followed was very complete. Sebastian looked at me with those blue eyes, and I became suddenly, acutely aware that I had just told the AlphaKing of Ironvale that the maps in his own castle were wrong, and I felt the blood leave my face in a slow, cold tide. But he was not angry. He was looking at me with that expression again, the one I had first seen at the lake, that slight recalibration, like a man adjusting the focus of his gaze to account for something that was closer than he had initially calculated. "Show me," he said quietly. And I did. We spent the better part of an hour on the third floor of the library while the morning light moved across the shelves and Brother Aldrich's footsteps occasionally drifted up from below, and I walked Sebastian through 3 manuscripts and the discrepancies between them and the corridor maps. And he listened with the concentrated attention of a man who was accustomed to receiving information and knew how to hear it without interrupting. When I finished, he stood with his arms crossed and his gaze on the last manuscript I had laid open, and he was quiet for a long moment. "No one has pointed this out before," he said finally. "Perhaps no one read carefully enough," I said. "Or perhaps they thought it was not their place to say so." He looked at me then, and something in the blue of his eyes shifted. Not the recalibration this time, but something warmer and less guarded, there for only a breath before it withdrew behind the usual stillness of his face. "You do not seem troubled by what your place is," he said. "I am troubled by it constantly," I said honestly. "I simply find that the truth is usually more useful than silence." He held my gaze for one more moment. Then he closed the manuscript, set it carefully back on the shelf, and walked toward the stair. At the top step, he paused without turning. "Tomorrow," he said, "I would like you to examine the Northern Territorial records, all of them, and write down what you find." He descended before I could answer, and his footsteps crossed the floor below, and the door opened and closed. And I stood in the morning light between the shelves with my heart doing something complicated and completely unhelpful in my chest. Cora was never going to believe this. I did not tell Cora. Not because I did not trust her. Cora was the kind of woman who kept secrets the way a good cloak keeps rain, completely and without complaint. But because saying it aloud would have made it real in a way I was not ready for. That the Alpha King of Ironvale had come to the library. That he had listened to me speak for nearly an hour about territorial manuscripts. That he had asked me to continue. Some things are too fragile for words before they have fully formed. So I said nothing, and I spent the following 3 days doing exactly what Sebastian had asked. Pulling every Northern Territorial record from the shelves, laying them out across the large reading table on the 3rd floor in chronological order, and working through them with the methodical attention that Brother Aldrich's training had sharpened into something close to instinct. I made notes on a separate parchment in my smallest handwriting, cross-referencing dates and names and the subtle inconsistencies that emerged when you read 4 accounts of the same event, and noticed which details appeared in only one of them. It was absorbing work, more absorbing than anything I had done before, which was a strange and quietly revolutionary thing to discover about myself, at 23 in a castle where I had arrived to scrub floors. Brother Aldrich noticed. He did not say anything directly, that was not his manner, but on the 2nd day he set a fresh pot of ink beside my work without being asked, and on the 3rd day he placed a cup of warmed, spiced cider at my elbow at the mid-morning hour, and these small gestures were, in their way, the warmest expression of approval I had yet seen from him. "You have a scholar's patience," he said, passing behind me on his way to the lower shelves. He said it to the air in front of him, not to me, in the tone of a man making an observation to himself that he was merely allowing me to overhear. I kept my eyes on my parchment and said nothing, and I felt something quiet and solid settle in my chest. Not pride exactly. Recognition, perhaps. The feeling of being seen accurately. Sebastian returned on the 4th day. He came in the late afternoon this time, when the light through the eastern windows had gone gold and long, and the library had its evening quality, the dust motes turning slowly in the slanted light, the shadows between the shelves growing soft and deep. I heard his step on the stair, and did not look up from my notes, because I had decided, somewhere in the preceding 4 days, that reacting visibly to his arrivals was a luxury I could not afford. He came to stand at the end of the reading table and looked at the spread of manuscripts and my pages of notes. And he was quiet for a moment in the particular way he had, absorbing rather than simply looking. "You found something," he said. "Several things." I set down my quill and folded my hands on the table. "The most significant is this. The northern border, as currently recognized by Iron Vale's formal agreements, does not match the border as described in 3 separate accounts, written within living memory of the original settlement. Someone adjusted the official record approximately 60 years ago, deliberately. Sebastian's expression did not change, but something in his stillness intensified, a quality of focused attention that reminded me of the way a hawk goes motionless before it moves. 60 years ago, he said. My grandfather's reign. Yes. And the adjustment favored whom? The house that currently holds the northern garrison, I said carefully. House Varen. The name sat between us in the warm library air, and neither of us spoke for a moment. House Varen. I had heard that name in the kitchen, too, spoken with the same careful flatness that people used when discussing things that were large and dangerous and not entirely resolved. The Lord of Varen was a Beta noble, whose family had held the northern garrison for 3 generations, whose loyalty to Iron Vale's crown was, by general servant quarter consensus, somewhat more theoretical than practical. You are certain, Sebastian said. I can show you, I said. Every document, every discrepancy, in sequence. I would not have brought it to you without being certain. He looked at me then with something that moved through his blue eyes too quickly and too privately for me to name, and then he pulled out the chair across the table from me and sat down, and we spent the next 2 hours going through every page I had prepared, document by document, while the evening light faded, and Brother Aldrich quietly lit the candles in the alcoves below, and pretended with remarkable dignity that there was nothing at all unusual about the Alpha King spending his evening in the library with an Omega servant from Ashfin. When we reached the last page, Sebastian sat back in his chair and was quiet for a long time. This changes the northern negotiation, he said finally. The council has been operating from the corrupted record for 60 years. Every agreement built on it is built on false ground. Yes, they will not receive this well. No, I agreed, but receiving it poorly does not make it less true. He looked at me across the table in the candlelight, and the corner of his mouth moved. Barely, the smallest possible fraction of a movement, there and gone in less than a second. And I thought, that is the closest I have seen him come to smiling. No, he said quietly, it does not. What I did not anticipate was what happened 2 mornings later in the Great Hall. I had been summoned, not by Sebastian, but by Marta, who delivered the instruction with the precise neutrality of a woman who had learned to carry unusual messages without attaching her own reaction to them. I was to attend the morning council, she said, to present the territorial findings. I stood in the corridor outside the Great Hall for 3 full minutes before I made myself open the door. The hall was larger than it appeared from outside, its ceiling vaulted and hung with the dark banners of Iron Vale, iron gray and deep blue, the wolf's head crest at their center. The long council table was already occupied, 8 men, all alpha or high beta, all in the kind of clothing that announced consequence. Lord Fenwick, the gray-haired head of the council, sat at the far end with the expression of a man who had been doing this for 30 years and found it increasingly tiresome. Beside him, a younger alpha I recognized as Lord Aldous, broad-shouldered, dark-eyed, with an easy confidence that sat on him like armor, watched me enter with open curiosity rather than the cold assessment I had expected. And at the head of the table, Sebastian, in his full formal leather with the wolf's head clasp at his shoulder, who did not look at me as I entered, but whose posture shifted in a way I had learned to read, a slight straightening, a settling of attention, that told me he knew exactly where I was in the room. Lord Fenwick looked at me the way a man looks at an unexpected item placed on his breakfast table. This, he said, addressing Sebastian without acknowledging me directly, is the source of the northern findings? Lady Penny of Ashfin, Sebastian said, and the title, which I was not, had never been, had no claim to, landed in the room with a quiet authority that dared anyone at the table to question it. She will present her findings. You will hear them. No one questioned it. I presented for 40 minutes. I had brought the key documents, organized as I had organized them on the library table, and I walked the council through each discrepancy with the same methodical care I had used with Sebastian, and my voice only wavered once, when Lord Fenwick interrupted with the particular kind of question designed not to seek information, but to demonstrate skepticism. And I steadied it, and answered him directly, and did not look at the head of the table for reassurance, because I knew, with some instinct I could not fully explain, that looking there would undermine exactly what I was trying to do. When I finished, the silence in the great hall was a different quality from the library's silence, heavier, more inhabited. Lord Aldous spoke first. If this holds, and the documentation appears to hold, then the Northern Garrison has been operating on falsified ground for 60 years. Varen will contest it. Varen can contest it with the original documents in front of him, Sebastian said, which he will not be able to refute. He will find another way to contest it, Lord Fenwick said, and his voice had changed. The skepticism had not disappeared, but it had moved aside for something more practical. He has allies on the eastern border. This will not be a quiet negotiation. No, Sebastian agreed. It will not. The meeting continued for another hour, moving into territory and strategy that was well above my station, and at a certain point Sebastian's gaze moved to me briefly, the smallest signal, barely a shift of his eyes. And I gathered my documents quietly and moved toward the door. I was nearly through it when Lord Aldous's voice followed me into the corridor. Well found, my lady, he said, loud enough to carry, warm enough to be genuine. I kept walking, because if I had stopped, I might have let the overwhelming strangeness of that morning catch up with me, and I needed to reach the library and the quiet and the eastern windows before I allowed myself to feel any of it. I made it as far as the corridor bend before Cora appeared around the corner with a basket of linens and stopped dead at the sight of my face. Penny, she said slowly, taking in whatever expression I was wearing. What in all the kingdoms happened to you this morning? I opened my mouth, closed it. I will tell you, I said carefully, but you will not believe me. She shifted the basket to her other hip and raised her eyebrows with the patience of a woman who had heard many things and been surprised by very few of them. Try me, she said. Cora believed me. She stood in the narrow corridor with her basket of linens pressed against her hip and listened to everything: the lake, the flat stone, the reassignment, the library, the manuscripts, the council hall, Lord Aldous calling me my lady as I walked out the door. And when I finished, she was quiet for a moment in the particular way Cora was quiet when she was organizing her thoughts rather than lacking them. Sebastian, she said finally, with great deliberateness, called you Lady Penny, in front of the full council. Yes. You are an Omega servant from Ashfen, who was assigned here to scrub floors. I am aware. She looked at me for another long moment. Then she picked up her basket and resumed walking and said over her shoulder, You should be very careful, Penny. It was not a warning against Sebastian. I understood that immediately, because Cora was too intelligent for simple warnings and too warm for cold ones. It was a warning about the space between what something was and what it appeared to be, and the way people who occupied that space tended to attract a particular quality of attention. Not all of it kind. I carried her words with me back to the library and set them alongside everything else I was carrying, which was already considerable. The trouble came, as trouble in castles usually does, not loudly, but sideways. It was Bess who brought me the first indication, 3 days after the council meeting, in the quiet hour before the evening meal. She found me in the library alcove where I had been working through a secondary set of Varan correspondence that Sebastian had sent up, with a sealed note asking me to look for anything relevant to the border question. Bess was a gentle, careful person who chose her words the way a person chooses footing on icy ground, deliberately with full attention. And when she sat down across from me with her hands folded and her gray eyes serious, I set down my quill. "There is talk," she said simply. "What kind?" "The kind that begins in the upper servants' quarters and moves down," she said. "Lady Seraphine's attendants. They are saying that an Omega from the outer villages has been given privileges above her rank, that it is inappropriate, that it suggests," she paused, choosing her words, "a particular kind of favor." The implications settled into the room without needing to be made explicit. Lady Seraphine of House Marin was the daughter of Iron Vale's most powerful Beta Lord, a woman of 25 who had been attached to the castle court for 2 years and whose position relative to Sebastian was, by all servant quarter understanding, one of considerable hope on her family's part. She was tall, dark-haired, impeccably dressed, and had the kind of polished confidence that came from a lifetime of being told that she was exactly the right sort of person for every room she entered. She had looked at me once, in the great hall corridor the morning after the council meeting, with an expression that I had filed away under things to be concerned about later and had not yet retrieved. Later, apparently, was now. "Thank you," I said to Bess. "Be careful," she said, which was exactly what Cora had said, and I was beginning to understand that the two most perceptive people in my immediate world had arrived at the same conclusion independently, which meant it was almost certainly correct. Lady Seraphine found me herself the following afternoon. I was crossing the inner courtyard with a stack of documents under my arm, moving from the library to the records room on the opposite side of the castle, when she stepped into my path with 2 of her attendants, arranged slightly behind her in the particular formation that announced this was not a casual encounter. She was, I noticed with the detached part of my mind that continued observing things even when the rest of me was bracing, genuinely beautiful. Dark hair dressed in an elaborate coil, a deep green gown with embroidered borders, the kind of composed and deliberate presence that a great deal of careful cultivation had produced. "You are the Omega from the library," she said. Not a question. "Yes, my lady." She looked at me with cool assessment, and I held still under it, the way I had learned to hold still in uncomfortable situations. Not with the rigid tension of fear, but with something quieter, a kind of patient waiting. "You presented before the council," she said. "I presented findings from the territorial records. Yes, that is an unusual role for a seasonal servant." "The findings were unusual," I said carefully. "The role followed from them." Something moved behind her composed expression. Not quite anger, more like the recognition of an opponent who was not going to make this simple. "You should understand," she said, her voice dropping slightly in register, taking on the particular quality of a statement meant to instruct rather than converse. "That Iron Vale has a particular order. Ranks exist for reasons. People who step outside their designated place." She paused. "You rarely find it comfortable when they are returned to it." I looked at her for a moment. The courtyard was not empty. 2 guards were visible at the far gate, and a pair of kitchen servants were crossing from the opposite direction. And I was acutely aware that how I responded in the next 30 seconds would determine something that I could not yet fully see the shape of. "I have not stepped outside my place, my lady," I said. "I was placed where I am by the king's instruction. If you have concerns about that placement, I would suggest they are more properly directed to him than to me." The silence that followed was the kind that has edges. Seraphine held my gaze for one more moment, and then she moved past me with her attendants in her wake, and I stood in the middle of the courtyard with my documents under my arm, and my heart conducting a very loud and agitated conversation with my ribs. I told Sebastian that evening. He had come to the library again. He came most evenings now, which Brother Aldrich accommodated with the dignified resignation of a man who had decided that some things were above his cataloging system. And I told him about Seraphine's warning in the courtyard without softening it, because I had established by now that softening things for Sebastian was both unnecessary and counterproductive. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, standing by the eastern windows with the last gray light of evening behind him. "Are you frightened?" he asked. I considered the question honestly. Of Lady Seraphine? No. Of what she represents. The court's ability to decide that I do not belong here. Yes, somewhat. "You belong here," he said. He said it simply, without drama or declaration, in the same tone he might have used to confirm that a document was correctly filed. As though it were a fact already established and only requiring, occasionally, to be stated aloud. I looked at him in the dim library light and felt something open quietly in my chest. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but the way a window opens in a room that has been closed too long, a slow, steady admission of air that changes the quality of everything inside. "Sebastian," I said, and the absence of my lord was deliberate. And he noticed it. I saw him notice it, that small adjustment in his expression. "Why do you come here every evening?" He held my gaze. "Because the work requires it." "The work," I said, "has not required it every evening. Some evenings you come and we do not discuss the work at all." A pause. Outside, the wind had picked up and was moving through the pines on the northern grounds. A sound like the lake in the dark, like the first night, like everything that had been quietly accumulating between us since the moment he sat down on a flat stone instead of doing what every law of rank and reason said he should have done. "No," he said finally, quietly. "Some evenings, it is not the work." The words settled between us with the particular weight of things that are true and known and have simply, until now, not been said. What happened next was not a dramatic declaration in a great hall, not a public proclamation that rearranged the court's understanding of itself in a single moment. It was slower than that and more permanent. Sebastian went to his counsel with the territorial documents and the evidence of House Varen's 60-year claim to falsified land. The negotiation that followed was precisely as difficult as Lord Fenwick had predicted. Varen contested, maneuvered, called in his Eastern alliances, and produced 3 weeks of the most complicated political pressure Iron Vale's council had navigated in a decade. Lord Aldous held the center of the council with steady intelligence. Brother Aldrich, to my considerable surprise, testified personally to the authenticity of the documents and the rigor of the cataloging process that had uncovered them, in language that left Lord Fenwick's skepticism with nowhere comfortable to stand. And Sebastian held. He held with the patience of a man who had learned that the most powerful thing a king can do is refuse to be moved before the truth has finished speaking. And in the end, the original border was restored. The falsified record was formally corrected, and House Varen signed an agreement that returned to Iron Vale's crown the garrison land that had never rightfully left it. On the evening after the final signing, Sebastian came to the library and stood in the doorway and looked at me across the room and said nothing for a moment. Then, "It is done." "I know," I said. "Lord Aldous sent word." He crossed the room and sat down across the reading table from me, as he had 100 times in the preceding weeks, and the candlelight was the same, and the smell of old parchment was the same, and everything was familiar, except that something had shifted in the quality of the air between us. Something that had been building with the slow patience of the work itself had reached, quietly and without announcement, its resolution. "The seasonal tribute ends in 4 days," he said. "Yes, you are expected to return to Ashfan." "Yes." He looked at me steadily. "I am asking you to stay." Not as a command. Sebastian had not once in all the weeks I had known him used his authority as a command in relation to me, which I had come to understand was, for him, a significant thing. A man of his rank and nature choosing, deliberately and consistently, to ask rather than require. As what? I asked quietly. As Royal Archivist, he said. Formally appointed. Your own rooms in the East Tower. A title that is not borrowed from courtesy but belongs to you by position. He paused. And as whatever else you choose to be, at whatever pace you choose to become it. The last part was careful and honest, and left the future open in exactly the right way, not promising more than he could offer, not obscuring what he hoped with diplomatic language. It was, I thought, the most genuinely human thing I had ever heard from a person of his power. Cora and Bess, I said. He blinked, a small disruption to his composure. I beg your pardon? If I stay, I said, I want permanent positions offered to Cora of the Western Fens and Bess, I do not know her family name, who came with the seasonal tribute. They are both more capable than their current assignments reflect. A pause. Then again. That smallest fraction of a smile. Done. And Brother Aldrich gets a second assistant, I added. He will not ask for one himself. He needs one. Also done. And the eastern windows in the servants' quarter. Penny. Yes? Is there a point at which you intend to answer the question I actually asked? I looked at him across the table. This man with his careful blue eyes and his tired patience and his private lake, and the scar along his jaw, and the long weeks of candlelit evenings that had built, stone by stone, something I had not gone looking for, and could not now imagine being without. Yes, I said. I will stay. The seasons turned at Ironvale, the way seasons turn in old kingdoms. Slowly, with ceremony, with the weight of everything that has happened in them, pressing gently against everything that is still to come. Cora became head of the household linen stores within 6 months, and ran them with the cheerful efficiency of a woman who had been waiting her entire life for someone to give her adequate authority. She also, in her characteristic manner, became the most reliably informed person in the castle about everything happening in every corridor, which turned out to be extraordinarily useful on multiple occasions. Bess was assigned to the Castle Healer's Hall, where it became apparent within a fortnight that she had a gift for the work that had simply never been given space to emerge. She was quiet and precise, and had a patience with frightened people that the senior healer, a weathered beta woman named Greta, declared was rarer than any herb in her stores. She stayed. She flourished. She stopped looking at the ground when she spoke. Brother Aldrich received his second assistant, a young beta scholar named Pell, who was earnest and occasionally chaotic, and who Aldrich regarded with the long-suffering affection of a man who had asked for help and received more enthusiasm than he strictly required. He was, despite himself, clearly fond of the boy within a month. Lord Fenwick remained skeptical of most things and everyone, which was, Lord Aldous cheerfully pointed out, the quality that made him the most useful member of the council. He eventually acknowledged, in his particular style, obliquely to someone else, in language that allowed plausible deniability, that the territorial restoration had been among the most significant political corrections of the past generation. Lord Aldous became, over time, something I had not expected. A friend, in the uncomplicated way that certain people become friends, through the accumulation of honesty and shared meals, and the particular ease of someone who never required you to be anything other than what you were. Lady Seraphine left Ironvale in the spring, returned to House Marin with her family's ambitions, gracefully redirected toward an Eastern alliance that suited them considerably better than waiting for a king whose attention had, evidently, settled elsewhere. She departed without incident, and without speaking to me again, which was, I thought, the best possible resolution for everyone involved. And Sebastian, who had sat on a flat stone beside a forbidden lake instead of sending for the guards, who had listened to an Omega servant from Ashfin talk about territorial manuscripts for 2 hours in candlelight, who had said you belong here with the same unadorned certainty he applied to everything he believed deeply and could not be moved from. On the morning of the first winter after I had stayed, he came to the library before Brother Aldrich arrived. when the frost was still on the inside of the eastern windows, and the early light came through them in thin, pale sheets, and he stood in the middle of the room and looked at me and said quietly, "I would like to ask you something." "You usually do," I said, setting down my quill. "This is different." I looked at him. The winter light was honest and clear, and it fell across his face without flattery. And I saw him exactly as he was, not the portrait in the great hall, not the weight of the title, but the man himself, with his careful eyes and his private exhaustions, and the thing he had been carrying alone for a very long time, before a woman in a forbidden lake had decided that lonely places needed company. "Then ask," I said. He did, and I said yes. We were married in the castle's great hall on the first clear day of spring, when the windows were open, and the light came in without asking permission, and Cora wept with the cheerful abandon of a woman who felt that the occasion entirely warranted it, and Bess stood very straight and very still beside her, with her eyes bright and her hands folded, and Brother Aldrich sat in the back row with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man who had predicted none of this, and was deeply satisfied by all of it. Sebastian held my hand throughout the ceremony with the careful, deliberate grip of a man who had decided on something, and intended to remain decided, and when it was done, and the hall filled with voices, and the smell of the feast being carried in from the kitchens, he leaned close and said, very quietly, so that only I could hear, "The lake," he said, "is no longer off limits." I laughed, genuinely, fully, the kind of laugh that belonged to open meadows and east-facing windows, and all the versions of freedom I had learned came in shapes I had not anticipated. "Good," I said, because I never entirely stopped going. He looked at me with those blue eyes and that smallest possible fraction of a smile, and it was enough. It was, in fact, everything. The kingdom of Ironvale continued as kingdoms do, with its complications and its councils and its borders requiring occasional correction. But in the East Tower, in a library with 3 tall windows, the records were accurate, the cataloging was flawless, and the woman who had once been an Omega servant from Ashfen sat at the head of the reading table with ink on her fingers, and a king who came every evening, not for the work, and knew exactly where she belonged. She was home, and she knew, with the same quiet certainty with which she had once waded into a forbidden lake and floated on her back and looked up at an open sky, that this was not the beginning of something. It was the thing itself, complete and permanent and entirely hers.